and gentlemen, dear colleagues, dear students, it is my pleasure to welcome you on the occasion of the United Nations International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. We're very excited to have you all here today to participate in our event on gender-based violence and development outcomes. And this event is organized by the gender group of the Center for Development Research, which we abbreviate as CEF, which is a research center associated to the University of Bonn. I am Tina Beuchelt, a senior scientist at CEF, and together with my colleague, Denise Aviles, we organized this event and will moderate it jointly. We will start with two welcome speeches by our directors from the Center for Development Research, and then our four invited experts will talk about their insights and experiences. And after that, we will have a public discussion session and answering also your questions. Meanwhile, you may enter your questions you have for the speakers anytime using the QA button at the lower bar in Zoom, which is next to the chat. And please also list the name of the speaker to whom the question is for. Denise Aviles will moderate the Q&A session, and we probably expect more questions than we will have time, so Denise may have to select some questions, but feel free to enter your question and we try our best to answer as much as possible. And if you have technical issues you can't hear or see or something, please use the chat function. We have somebody here to support us as well. Before handing the word over to our distinguished speakers, I just would like to briefly share some thoughts that influence the organization of this event. And one is my own research experience. I do, among others, research on land management, seed systems, and the adoption of agricultural technologies and improved practices, to which I often add a gender lens. And to better understand, for example, why farmers adopt new practices or why they start with higher yielding varieties or not, I then talk to women and men, how they allocate labor, how they allocate resources on the farm, and how they take decisions and why. And I realized that no matter in which countries of Asia, Latin America, or Africa I did my interviews, when it came to decision-making in agriculture, women frequently raised the issue of domestic violence. However, I personally did not further address it in my research, nor did I talk much to other researchers about it. So gender-based violence and my agricultural research were different topics, basically, for me. And recently, I started asking my colleagues working also in the agricultural sector on their experiences in this regard, and they all had made a similar experience. And I asked them, and did you address it? What did you do about it? And they also said, no, we don't address it. And that really struck me. Gender-based violence is a development issue, and that was recognized years ago. And also in our gender group at CEF, we discussed the experiences of us as female researchers being subjected to various forms of gender-based violence during our fieldwork. But we didn't really discuss on what women actually tell us during our field research on seemingly really unrelated topics. So we decided we have to change that. And this event is an opportunity to make the experiences of gender-based violence more visible. But what do we actually mean when we talk about gender-based violence? Gender-based violence can be any form of violence against women, against men, or other gender identities. And the important thing is that it's a violence against a person because of their gender. And the most pervasive form and a most common and known form is the violence, of course, against women and girls. Gender-based violence encompasses all types of violence. So it can be physical violence, sexual violence, but also psychological violence. And it is rooted in gender roles and inequality. It is rooted in harmful social norms and in the abuse of power, also giving unequal power relations. So today we have 4 excellent speakers representing research and practical experiences on gender-based violence from several countries in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and from Europe. And we take more in economist perspective and social science use, and we look at natural resource conservation biodiversity projects. And with that, we will also end with pathways for change or possible solutions. And I hope really that all of you will enjoy our speakers to come as much as I'm looking forward to that. And with that, I would actually like to give the word already to Professor Christian Burgermeister, our Executive Director of CEF, who's also liking to welcome you. Christian, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tina. Thank you, Denise, Tina and Denise, for this kind invitation. Very pleased to see so many participants, especially a warm welcome to all the distinguished speakers at this webinar. And it's a pleasure for me to say a couple of welcoming words, and I'm very much looking forward to listening to the forthcoming presentations of yours. As Tina already pointed out, we are an interdisciplinary research center at CEF, affiliated with the University of Bonn, and gender issues are transversal to CEF. They are an integral part of our strategy, and they're increasingly becoming relevant for discussions at CEF, discussions with regard to our ongoing research, discussions with regard to research that we envisage. And the already mentioned CEF Gender Group that has organized this webinar is a reflection of how important gender as a topic, as a cross-cutting issue has become for our work and for our strategic thinking. Awareness on gender-based violence has very much grown during the pandemic, and I guess everybody has come across reports in the media on this, and it has reached really alarming levels wherever you are. Now, even before the pandemic, gender violence or gender-based violence has been prevalent in many countries. And let me illustrate this with a couple of facts. Gender-based violence, especially violence against women and girls, is responsible for more deaths and injuries in the world of women, meaning females aged between 15 and 44, than cancer, malaria, traffic accidents, and war fatalities combined. I mean, one has to imagine this. 1 in 3 women and girls worldwide experience violence, and unfortunately and strikingly, disproportionately, women in low and lower middle income countries experience this. Give you an example from Africa. According to UN Women and NEPAD, about 45% of the women are affected by gender-based violence, and very often these kind of figures actually are in a way underreported, and the real figures are anticipated to be much higher. Most of the violence that is perpetrated against women originates from former husbands, intimate partners, and most often women do not seek any help or any sort of help once they experience these kind of violence. Women are socialized to varying degrees around the world to, in reality, accept gender-based violence as normal. A recent global study by the World Bank indicated that about 29% of women who had experienced gender-based violence concurred with the fact that wife beating is justified for arguing with the husbands. 25% thought of accepting gender-based violence when refusing to have sex, and 25% of the women in this survey thought that gender-based violence was acceptable when burning food. Gender-based violence plays a really important role in rural development. Yet, as Tina already pointed out in her introductory remarks, very, very little research has addressed the role of gender-based violence in agricultural and resource, in the agriculture and resource management sector. Tina, Denise and I had discussed this before, and the interesting thing is that gender-based violence has been proven to be a kind of a roadblock, a hindrance for the acceptance of various health and public health related policies. But the connection between, as Tina already pointed out, the connection between innovations and uptake of innovations in the agricultural sector and gender-based violence has never been made. And frankly, having worked in this sector, discussions with Denise and Tina on this were a kind of an eye-opener for me. So I think this webinar today is a very timely, not only reminder, but could be really like the kickoff of research that is really targeting gender-based violence and agricultural development and trying to connect these dots. Let me just sum up. ZEF is an inter and transdisciplinary research center, and I think the topic of today's webinar is a nice reflection of this, with 4 speakers from science and practice covering the social, from the kind of broad field from social science to natural resource conservation and biodiversity conservation as well. So I'm very much looking forward to this event. I'm very curious to hear from the distinguished speakers, and I'm also looking forward to a lively discussion. Thank you very much, and back to you, Tina and Denise. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for your welcome and also for pointing out the global dimensions of gender-based violence. I just would like to hand immediately over for the next welcome to Dr. Eva Jukana, who's the Interim Director of the Department for Political and Cultural Change at ZEF. Eva, please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, also from my side, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. It's really a pleasure to see also a couple of known faces. Hi, Constanze. Good to see you again. Yeah, I would like to welcome you, I think, a lot to this event, this important event at this important day. Thanks for organizing this, Tina and Denise. Really, it's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I'm also very curious about all the presentations. We do not have a lot of time, but allow me just a few words. I think a lot has been pointed out by Christian already, but I would like to stress that, of course, gender-based violence is not just physical or domestic violence, it is also structural violence and gender-based structural violence. And I think this can also nicely be seen in the program of today's workshop. And it is about unequal access to education, to common goods, to natural resources, for example, land. We will hear a bit more about that later on. And it has, of course, a lot of implications for our future generations. It is a symptom, but also a tool to reinforce inequalities and also, power imbalances in every part of society. Even though I really don't want to get into an instrumental language of development agents, gender-based, the more violence against women, the less development outcomes, you know. But gender-based violence is an impediment to any kind of human development. Of course, we have to say that. And physical and structural violence perpetuates inequality, discourages independent decision-making, and has become a natural means of expression also in art, music, culture, and the media. And I think either in rural and in urban environments. And of course, also Christian mentioned that before, and also Tina, there is a need for continued research with gender-sensitive approaches, methods, and concepts. For example, intersectionality approaches need to be applied more consequently and systematically into development research and critical and reflective development research. In order to engage into transformative action. And I think this is what we all want to do somehow in one way or the other as academics, as researchers, engage in transformative action. And having said that, I would like to, thank you all again for being here and enjoy the program. And I'm really looking forward to it. Welcome to all of you. And thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Eva, for pointing out the linkages to our research and how research should be, and the linkages to several development aspects. And with that, I would like to welcome already our first speaker, Dr. Sonja Akhter, who is an assistant professor at the National University of Singapore. Her research is situated on the nexus of agriculture, environment, and development from an economic and public policy perspective in the Asia-Pacific region. And she has worked extensively on agriculture and food policy, natural disasters, and women's empowerment. She graduated with a PhD in environmental management and development from the Australian National University and holds a master's degree in economics. And previously, she has also worked at the International Rice Research Institute and at the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research, the UFZ in Germany. And with that, I would like to hand over the word to Sonja, please.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me to this event. So this is a really nice introductory speeches that set the scene perfectly, which really makes my job easy. So I work on development issues, and one of my three research priorities is women's empowerment, and part of women's empowerment is domestic violence. So one of the indicators of women's empowerment is freedom from domestic violence. So that's why my research overlaps or looks at quite deeply into the aspects of violence against women. So as Tina and other speakers mentioned, that violence against women is, or gender-based violence is a spectrum. So it's really, there are different and a wide range of different ways violence against women or gender-based violence can be perpetrated. But one of the most common form of violence or gender-based violence is intimate partner violence. So this is where my research focuses mostly. So I work most closely on intimate partner violence. So today I'll talk about my research findings of two projects. So in the first project, we looked at, we used data from India, and we looked at how intimate partner violence affects children's education. And in the second research, I used data from Pakistan, and we look at how trust in informal institution can work as an indirect deterrence against intimate partner violence. So as you probably already heard that the violence against women, and particularly intimate partner violence, is quite widespread in both developed and developing countries. So one of the estimates that we have is that 30% of the women have ever experienced physical violence, or physical or sexual partner violence, and over a third of the women have experienced either non-partner sexual violence or physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner or both. But these numbers, keep that in mind, that these numbers are underestimation, because there is a underreporting bias for a variety of reasons, either because women don't feel safe to disclose the experience of the violence, or because it's socially accepted and it's so normalized that women actually don't think that this is something that they should report. And as you also know that violence against women or intimate partner violence has a direct effect on women's welfare, and it also affects women's labor force participation. It has in health and legal costs, negative effects on women's mental health and well-being in general. So these are the direct effects on women's of intimate partner violence on women's welfare, and these are already widely known. So, but what is not very widely known is what are the spillover effects? How, when mothers are affected by intimate partner violence, how that affects children's well-being and children's outcome. So in this research that we do, we look at this a specific aspect of intimate partner violence, which is the spillover effect and how it affects children's education. So the context of this study is India, and India is a country where women have very low economic, social, and political empowerment, and this makes women highly vulnerable to partner-induced physical oppression. And in the incidence of domestic intimate partner violence is so widespread in India that a case of domestic violence is reported in every 5 minutes. And also the most recent statistic shows that 41% women experience domestic violence during their lifetime and 30% in the past 1 year. There are several factors. So there is a lot of studies has been done, and these studies show that there are several factors that are drivers, work as drivers of intimate partner violence. And they can be, most commonly, these are dowry disputes, cultural norms, the patriarchal society, as well as women not being able to bear a son. India is also a country that is characterized by low human capital development. So the World Economic Forum's Human Capital Report 2017 ranks India 103 among the 130 countries of the world. And one of the factors that contribute to low human capital development is low educational attainment. So what we try to do in our research is we try to connect these two aspects, that whether the high incidence of intimate partner violence has anything to do with India's low educational attainment. So now one can wonder that why intimate partner violence would affect children's educational attainment. So we looked at the theories and different literature and empirical evidence and previous studies in different countries, and we came up with these pathways, potential pathways through which mothers' experience of intimate partner violence might affect children's education. So these specific pathways are maternal health. So if mothers experience intimate partner violence, that can affect mothers' physical as well as psychological health, which can impede their capacity to take care of the children, as well as supervise children's education or learning at home. And incidence of domestic intimate partner violence also disrupts home environment. So it makes the home environment unsafe. So children are then spend a lot of time in anxiety, and they constantly worry about their mother's well-being as well as their siblings' well-being, and that also limits their ability to focus on education as well as their capacity to learn at home. And also there are various psychological studies in the psychology literature that shows that exposure to intimate partner violence of children reduces their cognitive functioning. It compromises their memory functions as well as their function to focus on studies. So these are the three pathways through which there is evidence in the literature that intimate partner violence might affect children's educational attainment. So we use a data set, a panel data, which is called Indian Human Development Survey. wave 1 and wave 2. So this is a nationally representative panel data set involving approximately over 40,000 households from all states of India. So the first wave was conducted in 2004 and 5, and the second wave was conducted in 2011 and 12. So in this data set, women aged between 15 and 19-year-old and women who were ever married were interviewed. And altogether, there was about 47,529 women observations were available in this data set. So we use this data set to match the mother's information with children's information. So we also have child level data about educational attainment of children aged between 8 and 11 years. So we matched this children data with their mother's data, and we found about, our data point was about 25,000, which is a very, very large data set. So for human capital, we used 4 outcomes. 2 of them were school-based indicators. One was on-pace schooling, and the other one is whether the child has ever repeated a grade. And the other outcomes were, the 2 other outcomes were standardized test scores. One is arithmetic test and another one was reading test. So these tests were conducted during the survey at home. So one of the contribution of this study is that this study uses an indirect measurement of domestic intimate partner violence. As you know, that the direct questioning method, where we ask women directly that whether you have experienced domestic violence or not, that is associated with underreporting bias, because women don't want to reveal their experience of domestic violence. So in this survey, the questions were asked directly. Instead of asking women directly whether you have experienced violence in the past 12 months, women were asked whether it is common in their community for women to experience violence if they leave home without permission, if they don't bring dowry. And so there are 5 scenarios, and women were asked whether it's common in their community for husbands to beat their wives. So this kind of questioning method helps minimize the underreporting bias. But also a downside of this kind of questioning is that it doesn't directly measure experience of domestic violence. So we call this vulnerability to intimate partner violence instead of calling it incidence or experience of intimate partner violence. So what we did is we just summed the responses by each individual up and constructed an index, which we call vulnerability to intimate partner violence index. So these are our main results. So in this results, in this table, we have these 4 outcomes that I mentioned in the previous slides or in the columns. So the first column is on-pace schooling, second column is whether the child has ever repeated a grade, and the column 3 and 4 presents results on standardized reading score and standardized math score. And in the second row, you can see this is the mother's vulnerability to intimate partner violence index. So this is that variable is the sum of those responses to those 5 questions that I showed in the previous slide. So what we ran panel ordinary least square fixed effects model, including a large number of control variables for child's characteristics, parents' characteristics, household characteristics, as well as the community characteristics. We find that the relationship between mother's vulnerability to intimate partner violence is highly significant and negative to these 4 educational outcomes. So what does this mean is that when the mother is highly exposed to or highly vulnerable to intimate partner violence, that reduces the likelihood of the child being on pace schooling, that increases the likelihood of the child repeating a grade. And on column 3 and 4, it shows that it reduces the child reading score, significantly reduces the child's reading score and math score. So this presents evidence that in mother's experience of intimate partner violence significantly affects and adversely affects children's educational outcome. So in this table, I desegregate the results for boys and girls, and I find that for boys, and the results are significant for on-pace schooling and math score, but it's not significant for grade repetition and reading score. But for girls, all 4 outcomes are significant and negative, which means that it's the girls who are more affected compared to boys. It's probably because girls are stay at home more, so they witness the intimate partner violence more than the boys, more than their brothers, and also that they are more close and attached to their mother. Probably that also increases the risk for girls. So in the next half of my presentation, I'll try to quickly summarize another research where I look at how, so we know the impact, but we actually don't work a lot on the solution. So this paper looks at the solution, partly at least. So we look at, between 2005 and 2015, there's a lot of studies, lots of legislation has been introduced to protect women against domestic violence. But what we have seen is that these legislations have not been very effective in protecting or curbing the incidence of domestic violence. So this is partly because people don't have access to the legal justice system, particularly in rural areas, because these, particularly in South Asia, in low-income countries, the justice system has very low capacity, rate corruption is very high, and the pace is very slow, and the cost is also very high. So people don't access the formal justice system. Rather, they rely on informal institutions, and which offer quasi-judicial services by running quick and cheap dispute resolution forums. So recently, there's a lot of focus on these informal institutions, and also there are some initiatives by national and international agencies to formalize these institutions. So then I wondered whether these institutions formalizing or expanding, strengthening the capacity of informal institution can be a solution to protect or offer women more protection against violence, domestic violence. So I use data from Pakistan to test this hypothesis. So one can argue that why institutional trust can affect domestic violence. So this is a theory which shows that if there is high trust in informal institution, that will make people, husbands particularly, more law-abiding, and also make people happier and improves people's personal well-being and happiness, which may contribute to marital happiness and family well-being. And it can also increase trust in neighbors, also in strangers, which can improve social efficacy as well as social ties. And all of these together may lower men's tendency to perpetrate violence against their wives. So I use a data set called Pakistan Rural Household Panel Survey, which has around 2,000 interviews, around 2,000 households. So the interview was conducted in 3 provinces of Pakistan. And I have around 1,600 of husband-wife pair in my data set. Now, since I don't have much time, I quickly jump into my findings. So my findings shows that on the row, I present the informal institutions effectiveness. So if husbands believe that informal institution is effective in offering justice, then that reduces their tendency to commit violence against their wives. So also column 4 shows that higher trust in informal institution reduces men's tendency to commit violence against their wife. In the second panel, I use a different way to measure institutional trust, and that also shows that higher trust in informal institution reduces their tendency to commit violence against wives. And this also shows that when men have higher trust in their institution, that they also tend to believe that institution has a higher legitimacy, they have higher subjective well-being, and that also improves their relationship with close family members. So quickly summarizing my findings is what the study from India shows that mothers vulnerable to domestic violence adversely affects children's education in India. The second paper study shows that good governance at the local level can act as an indirect deterrence for violence against women in Pakistan. And I also don't find any evidence that informal village institutions play any direct role at the moment in combating or augmenting domestic or other forms of violence against women. And finally, all of these findings actually support some optimism surrounding informal institutions' direct role in enhancing women's welfare in Pakistan, and also in line with the current initiative to empower these institutions. I would recommend that we need to build capacity among these institutions so that they can handle domestic violence cases, as well as they are more gender sensitive. And female representation in these informal institutions also is paramount, important, so that they are more gender inclusive, as well as they protect women's welfare and protect women from violence. Thank you very much. I'll be happy to answer questions later, and also will be happy to give more details about these studies if you are interested.
Thank you very, very much, Sonja, for this very thoughtful and enriching talk with your study results. I mean, providing not only the overview of how it is in Asia, but also really pointing out the effects of domestic violence on school results, which I found much more intense than I expected, especially that it affects girls much more than boys. And also pointing out, it was great to point out possible solutions with trust in institutions. And I think Emily later on in her talk also comes back to women's leadership, and that can be very nicely linked. So thanks a lot again. We move now from a rather economic and policy perspective in Asia to a rather ethnographic research perspective in Africa, specifically Ghana. And I would like to welcome, therefore, our next speaker, Constance Avimpoka Akurugu. Dr. Akurugu is a lecturer in sociology and in gender studies at the Simon Dombo University of Business and Integrated Development Studies in Ghana. Her research interests include transnational feminist discourses and women's empowerment practices, focusing on cultural translation of theory and decoloniality on gender power relations. And specifically, she's interested in gender justice research and advocacy, in gender-based violence, and gendered cultural practices in Ghana and sub-Saharan Africa. She also provides trainings on gender for national and international organizations, and obtained her PhD in sociology from the Newcastle University in the UK. So I hope she's sitting in Ghana. We had some issues with the internet connection beforehand, but I hope it will work. And Constance, I will hand over the word to you.
Thank you very much, Tina. And trying to share my, Thanks very much, Tina. And thanks to everyone for making it to this program. Thanks to the organizers for organizing it. So, as Tina said, I am based here in the northwestern part of Ghana. And like she said, my research, unlike Sonja's empirical presentation now, I'm going to draw on my ethnographic research in northwestern Ghana, and also on existing literature to create some insights into the situation of gender-based violence across Ghana and northern Ghana, and how this impacts livelihoods in northern Ghana. Yes, so this is the outline of our presentation. So like previous speakers have all alluded to gender-based violence is a global phenomenon because it affects people across all of the regions across the globe. So women and vulnerable groups all over the world suffer in both similar and different ways the consequences of gender-based violence. So in Ghana, as it is elsewhere across the globe, as Sonja just pointed to us, 1 in 3 women is said to have suffered some form of physical male violence. And this actually represents quite a grave underestimate if we consider that there are pervasive sociocultural norms and practices that tend to see violence against women as a normal part of intimate partner relationships. So one of the earliest studies in Ghana on gender-based violence is that which was conducted by Rosemary Ofe-Abuaji. And in that study, she says that in Ghana, people don't talk about wife beating because it is seen as an acceptable part of our social mores. Yet a groundbreaking study of its time was that of Drs. Koka-Appiah and Kathy Cusack in 1998. And this was quite groundbreaking in the sense that it was a nationwide survey which delved into the issue of gender-based violence against women and children across the length and breadth of Ghana. So what is really worrying in this report is that it shows how male violence against women is quite prevalent and how this tends to be normalized by duty bearers, including chiefs, queen mothers, including educationists, including social workers, who we would expect that will be advocates against gendered violence against women and children. A more relatively recent study is that of the Institute of Development Studies, Ghana Statistical Service, and their associates. And in this study, it is said that 23% of women, as well as 13% of men, thought that beating a wife was okay if she did not prepare your dinner, or if she was rude towards the man, it is just okay. Or if the devil came over the man, it will be okay for him to just spank the woman a little. So these views, this kind of gloomy discoveries led the authors of this work to project that gender-based violence will persist in the Ghanaian society for a very long time because the cultures make it possible for the victims of gender-based violence to be blamed. It was your fault. If you had behaved well, he probably not have assaulted you. These kinds of views. So the horrors, the studies on gender-based violence across Ghana draw our attention to the horrors that gender-based violence can engender, including a very violent extermination of lives. And in quite a case that was popular here in Ghana last year was the passing of a woman known as Lillian Deju, who was assaulted, resulting in her death by a very influential businessman, and that case is still in court. Recently, there have been issues of missing of women and their spouses. In one particular case, the spouse is the main suspect because of the way he has acted or not acted when the woman went missing. So if we take our attention to the visuals on our right, you see the one up there is a visual of a nude woman, and this is part of widowhood rights, particularly in the northeastern part of Ghana, where I come from. So when a woman's husband dies, she's supposed to go through certain purification rituals, which are supposed to cleanse and to delink her from the spirit of the deceased husband. But it can also be very dehumanizing because women are sometimes made to drink concoctions that they don't even know what is in. They are meant to be secluded and they are even subjected to nudity, as we can see here. The visuals down there are those of a woman here in Wa who was badly attacked this way by her husband, and then afterwards he went into hiding. So these are just two visuals. Yet a case that has been more heartbreaking also here in Ghana is that of the lynching of a 90-year-old woman who met her untimely death just because she was accused of being a witch. So we have cultural norms, cultural practices that allow people to just take liberty at exterminating the lives of other people. And these are some of the consequences. Sometimes women are also threatened that they will be ejected from their home if they were not to yield their economic resources, even including microcredit loans to the husband, because I have brought you into my home and you are staying in here, you have no right to say you won't give me that money, even if it's a loan and you have to pay back. So I'll send you packing. And then the woman is afraid because she will have to go away without her children because of the patrilineal system that we practice, of the descent that we practice here in northern Ghana. So specifically in northern Ghana, these deep-seated sociocultural norms, the practice and the rituals, they engender background conditions that are conducive and also predispose women to violence against women. And these kinds of attitudes tend to be so normal. They tend to be seen as a normal part of a woman's daily life, as part of marriage. So the woman is expected to show the family structures and institutions some respect by not reporting to the law enforcing agencies, for instance, like the police. Otherwise, she'll be seen as a bad woman, she'll be stigmatized, and she actually even risks being evicted from the marital homes. So gender-based violence within this context then have grave consequences for women's livelihood options, but also the outcomes, because women's livelihoods and outcomes are closely tethered to the natural environment in this semi-arid, harsh climatic zone that we find ourselves in northern Ghana. So these kinds of prevalence of violence against women and its normalization and all that women go through take place within the context of a country that tries to pride itself as a gateway to Africa, as a beacon of democracy. And to make us look good, Ghana has always acceded to international frameworks and conventions on rights, including those that guarantee and also protect women from abuse, such as the CEDAW, and even we also have the Maputo Protocol, and all the provisions that they have for protecting women from violence. Back home too, we have our constitutional provisions, we have the Domestic Violence Act, the Criminal Code, and all of these have provisions that make violence against women criminal, punishable by the law, and yet these just go on. So the question is, why do this persist despite all of this legal environment that I have just mentioned too? Yeah, but the issue is the dominance of customary norms and practices, particularly if you move away from the center, like the big cities, to the rural areas. So the dominant presence of these kinds of norms and rules as things that govern social life means that the state legal institutions are quite limited in their effectiveness. So during my ethnographic field research, when I asked one participant, why is it that we have this level of violence against women in rural Ghana? And this was a chief, he's late now. He said to me that the problem is that there is diminishing effectiveness of the law right from the city to the village. Another research participant of mine, who is a clan head of a clan, said to me that as for these rights issues, that's the rights talks, they are just empty words uttered over the air and therefore cannot be the basis for anything at the community level. What works here is what our forefathers have put in place. So both of these perspectives draw our attention to the dominant presence and influence of customary laws and practices in rural northern Ghana, and how they then make it difficult for the state legal frameworks and institutions to work in order to protect women who are violated. So you realize that the women are even afraid to even go forward because she cannot guarantee her safety once she goes to the police or even the domestic violence and victim support unit of the Ghana Police Service to report that she has been abused by her husband. So rather she should be advised by her mother, by her auntie, by the older women in the house to just cope with it, because this is how we have always coped with it, you know. So yours is not any different, just put up with it. Yeah, but these customary norms and practices and the violence that they engender against women are not without consequences, because they adversely affect women's livelihoods and increase their vulnerability in the context of this risk source case setting. Because Northern Ghana is the poorest part of this country, and for decades, poverty level, deprivation have been extremely high. So according to the Ghana Living Standards Survey, if we even take only 2016 and 2017, we'll see that poverty in Northern Ghana, the rural savannah, particularly the rural areas, stands at 67.7%. And now we can understand the intensity of this. If we were to compare this to the incidents across Ghana, like the average for the whole country for the same period, which stands at just 23%. So it is an area that is very fragile because we live in a semi-arid area, and women are constrained in terms of natural resource access. So, but someone might say, what about the men? So both the women and the men are exposed to the harsh realities of chronic poverty and deprivation that are occasioned partly by our location in the semi-arid area, but also by the legacies of colonialism, which ensure that the northern part of Ghana was deliberately underdeveloped because it was meant to be an area of labor reserve to service the plantations in the forest regions in the southern part of Ghana. But within this level of vulnerability is the fact that women's own is even more harrowing due to a concatenation of factors that work to create their specific and unique experience. For instance, we have a male-centric inheritance system, which means that property such as land, cattle, which are the main sources of livelihoods for majority of people around this part of the country, are passed only from one male to another within the family. As well as marriage across northern Ghana, and particularly in rural northern Ghana, women are expected to move away from the natal family sometimes, and with the support that the system brings, and to join the husband and his agnetic kin in a dwelling place provided for by that family. So within this new family, the woman is supposed to be supported in it, because it's supposed to be her new home, but this support does not always come, because you find yourself as an outsider in the midst of a group of people who are all kin, and they don't even trust your loyalty, because they think one day, if the marriage is no more, you are likely to even betray their family secrets and all of that. Yeah. So within this context, women's access to productive resources such as land, cultivable land, depends on their relationships with male members of the marital family. And this gives rise to what I have described as an ambivalent identity position for the woman, because the woman neither belongs fully to the marital nor the natal family. And this kind of identity category constrains the woman's livelihood outcomes. For instance, the ability to attain food and income security, or even to acquire improved social status within the community. So this is just to contextualize all that I've been saying. Is the case of a woman in my ethnography who is the most hardworking member of her family, does most of the work in the family, but then her husband is the one who is in charge, because this is what the norm is. The land is for the man, and so even if the woman works on the land, the proceeds are proceeds of his farm. So he has control over how to appropriate them. So her husband, who threatens her all the time that he will one day slash her throat, sells the produce and drinks with them. So this woman then will have to look for other sources like brewing pitol, the locally brewed beer, to provide food for the family, or to pick wild vegetables to provide food for the family. When she asks her husband to let her do her own separate farm so that she can appropriate the produce, the man said, no, you cannot do that whilst you stay in my house. But this behavior of her husband means that food insecurity is such a recurrent issue within her household. But her case is not an isolated one. Across most part of rural northern Ghana, where resource control and decisions are vested in the authority of men, women's access to productive resources are seriously constrained. Yet I also want to draw attention to the fact that the kinds of constraints that the women find themselves do not mean that they are dupes of patriarchal norms. The women sometimes reflect deeply about their chances at the twilight of their years if they wanted to leave the marital family. So in bringing this to a close, Northern Ghana is a place that is extremely deprived because we live in a fragile ecological zone. A combination of factors make women's livelihood situations very precarious for them within this context. So in order to enhance women's ability to pursue sustainable livelihood, there is a need for us to sustain the efforts at transforming the power imbalances in the negative sociocultural practices that make it difficult for women to operate at the same level, but that also perpetuates violence against women. So we also need to support rural women to develop resilient livelihood outcomes. In one of my research, I looked at a project known as Water for Resilience project, which is a climate smart approach to helping build the resilience of women within these areas. We also need to engage with the stakeholders such as the traditional leaders, family heads, in terms of transforming the cultural norms that make it difficult for women and girls to inherit productive resources. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Constance, for this quite shocking and very pointy talk about gender relations and gender-based violence and linking it to rural livelihoods and the well-being of especially women. You shared very in-depth insights and experiences, and I think they are comparable to many countries also across Africa. And I found it very striking how you pointed out the normalization of violence despite a different legal environment. You mentioned transforming power balances in the end, and I'm very glad to have Emily as our last speaker, who will then address on her experiences of a various range of solutions. Yeah, we can't discuss right now. We have to shift it for the end. There are, of course, many more things to add. But we will travel again to another continent and to another experience and perspective. So we move now to Latin America, and I would like to welcome our next speaker, Priscilla Pedro Ricali from Peru. So Priscilla is a lecturer in the Faculty of Psychology at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru, from which she also obtained her master's degree in psychology. She teaches there as well as does research on violence and gender issues with an intersectional approach. And she's also a capacity building advisor at an NGO called, in short, PROMSEX, and the full name is Promotion and Defense Center for Sexual and Reproductive Rights. And she's also a consultant for various other NGOs and private organizations and the government on gender-related issues. Within her role at PROMSEX, she currently works within a biodiversity conservation project and will tell us about her experiences on the role of gender-based violence for the management of natural resources and specifically the protection of biodiversity. And with that, Priscilla, I'd like to hand over to you.
Okay, thanks again, Tina. Thanks again to everyone that is here right now. Today I'm gonna present, as Tina said, a gender-based violence intervention here in Peru. And first of all, I want to introduce you a little bit about my country. We have a very wide variety of biodiversity. We are now facing many problems because many environmental defenders are facing charges. Also, they are being persecuted by very criminal groups. So it's very important nowadays to focus on how, what can we do to prevent that violence, and also to focus on the gender-based violence that it's against and inside these communities. Today, I'm gonna tell you about one specific community here, and in Champuyacu, it's the region where it takes place, this community. And also, I want to tell you that this program that I'm gonna tell you about, it's being developed in partnership with Conservation International. That Conservation International, it's working here for many, many years. And they developed this project that it's called Bosque de las Nuas, that it can be translated as the Forest of Women. Nuas is women in Aguajún. Aguajún is this community that it's here in Peru. It's really a big community. It takes place in many, many regions around the Amazonian. And this project has been already implemented around 10 or 12 years, but lately they seem to recognize that gender violence, it's really important to focus on. So they have shifted the project. So now it's an initiative that is implemented with a gender perspective and also with an intersectional approach. I'm gonna focus on that as well. And this program has allowed women to make decisions, especially about their economic, because in many regions in Peru, the man is like the leader of the house, and he takes all the economic incomes and he administrates them. So women has no voice at all about their, how are they gonna manage those resources. And also this program, it's important because it focuses on the management of the forest and the rescue of the use of traditional plants. This is a problem right now in Peru because many, especially young people and children, are now on indigenous communities, are now shifting their incomes, and they focus on driving cars or implementing a store rather than focus on the traditional plants. So that's the knowledge is being now lost, and many people are working as well as us to recover that, because we don't wanna lose that, because it's really important as our heritage. And also this project promotes the intergenerational transmission of traditional knowledge, not only about traditional plants, but also how can you use these plants to cure some illness. For example, here during the pandemic, they have discovered like a recipe with some plants that can be used against COVID. And it was really important because that was an efficient way to face this pandemic, because in Peru, it has take many lives. And now we lost many lives of people because of the pandemic, because we don't have a very strong health institution, and we don't have access to many resources. So it was really important. So we are working to recover that as well. And we want to preserve biodiversity. So it was important when Tina told me that they focus on biodiversity, and we want to let you know that it's really important to implement these projects, but also with a gender perspective. And I'm gonna tell you why now. And so what can we know about the Champuyaco community? As I told you, this is one of the many communities of Aguajún, that it's an indigenous community, that it's spread around all of Peru and many other countries. And the population in this community is about 600 people nowadays. And especially they are distributed in families. So they know each other because there are so few of them. And in this, in the Aguajún population, the language is vital. So that's also a thing that they are working on, because many children nowadays are shifting and they prefer to speak Spanish because they think that it's a better approach to get out of the community, and they don't want to learn their native language anymore. But women especially are the ones that are taking care of this. In the community, for example, there is like a school where they teach all of the materials in Aguajún, and it's really important. But the main problem with that is that this is an only school, and people has to go there, and they have to invest many resources because it's kind of far from the community. So that's a problem, because many of them are in a situation of poverty, and they only get incomes, especially when there is like a coffee manufacturing company there, but their job is not stable. So they will have like little incomes from time to time. Especially women are the ones that are taking care of them, okay? Because also the sexual distribution of labor, it's, you can see, as you can imagine here in this community, women are, their mainly job is to focus on children, and also focus on, for example, people that are sick. And also they have many other labors. They also have many stores, many entrepreneurships that they are developing. And men usually only go to work for few minutes or few hours a day. And nowadays it's also a problem, because men are preferring to go to nightclubs, to visit other places, to buy cell phones, rather than focus on their children. And also the main productive activity, as I was telling you, in these communal lands, because the lands are not a property of only a person, but it's a communal land. It's a coffee cultivation, yeah, okay? But I have to tell you that the principal entrepreneurs and the people that are getting more profit of this coffee cultivation are non-indigenous people. So mainly there are foreign people that go there. They hire some of these people, and they don't pay them the good fare for their jobs. So that's also a problem. That's why there are many poverty rates around these lands. And also there is no health post in the community, which was a pretty bad sign, but it was also pretty bad during the pandemic, because many of them had died of COVID because they don't have a good system, a good health system. And nowadays we are also facing that they don't want to get the vaccine, for example. So it's like a problem there, because the vision of the community is that the government, the Peruvian government, doesn't care about them because of what they have seen during the years. So it's an important job nowadays to get them to trust more the governmental institutions. And also there are high rates of illiteracy, mainly among women, as you can imagine, because parents think that women don't get as much from education as men, and that they have to focus only on taking care of children. And also sometimes when they have many kids, they will take like the big girl of the family to take care of them when they are working, for example. So it's also a problem. That another facts that you can know about Champuyacu is that most women give birth at home. So there has been many deaths around that because they don't have all the equipment to give birth at home. Also, there is malnutrition around kids. And another important issue that we have discovered, because as I was telling you before, not only do we do an intervention, but first we conducted a research so we can get to know the community before we can plan and design the intervention. And we discovered, for example, that there are many people that are that have sexually transmitted infections. And this is due to a bigger problem that it's the recurrence of men to foreign brothels. So many men they prefer to go to foreign brothels to have entertainment, and they can say it, but they will come back to the community and they will transmit these infections and diseases to women. Also, men do not attend to medical campaigns, especially when you conduct medical campaigns in the community. Only women will be the ones that will come, but men don't think that that's an important issue that they will take care of. And also there is high rates of violence against indigenous women. And also it's because of the condition of triple discrimination, this gender, ethnic condition, and the social and economic exclusion that we have talked before as the structural violence that it's also against women, especially here in Peru, and especially with indigenous people, because they are not recognized as citizens of the country. So that's a main issue as well. And I wanna focus on the indigenous cosmovision because they face many relations that are based on the principle of complementary, and they conceive gender relations based on duality. And mainly these gender relations are based on duality, complementary, and balance, and they are based on harmony, understanding, and mutual respect. But this has shifted a little because with the influence of the other, we can say more the Occidental cosmovision, this has shifted, and many women are facing high rates of violence. That's why I wanna walk you through a little timeline of how we get to be a part of this project. First, they were developing this project, the Bosque de las Nubes, and they identified many gender violence cases, especially sexual cases. And I have to say that Conservation International has many partners, local partners that work in Champuyacu, and they have discovered that they have many cases and they don't know how to face them. And also they have a kind of bad experience because sometimes they will tell the authorities that there has been a sexual violence case, but the authorities will come and the community will say that there is nothing happening, or they will make an arrangement, especially an economic arrangement about that case. So women, when we interview them, they were pretty hopeless because they think that they don't have like a saying, or they don't have any right in the community. And also because the main laws that you can at some point you can, for example, sue someone, you can do that because there is a social pressure because of the community. It's really important that you can stick to their communal statute. So that's really, really important to them. And also, so we force an alliance to reduce these cases, and we design an intervention with intercultural approach, and also with an intersectional and gender approach. And we develop some workshops. First of all, we aim those workshops at partners, these local partners of Conservation International, then to women, and then the men in the community. Our main goal was to encourage women in this project to participate safely in the conservation of natural resources and economic activities that were promoted by Conservation International. So we wanted to increase their knowledge about their legal rights, that they know that they have rights, also about the risk of violence and their sexual and reproductive health. We conducted this first intervention, this first phase with 14 Awajún women leaders. They will come, and we at some point we talk about how we're gonna make these interventions sustainable around time. So we decided to implement some replicas, as we call, is that women that came to that workshop, they will do as well another like little interventions with another women. They will go to their houses, they will implement the same workshop, so as well they can become agents, and they will be recover their autonomy at some point. Our main results, we know that women were relegated to housework mainly and salaried work, and their routine also was plagued by tasks that prevent them to participate in lecture activities, for example. And another important discovery of the intervention and of the research was that men drink a lot of alcohol when they are not working, so that's becoming also an important issue nowadays. Also, they indicated that there should be justice in case of violence, because they, most of all, there are high rates also of suicide, because many women face this violence, sexual violence, physical violence, and other, for example, economic violence, and they are hopeless because they don't seem to get that justice. So they will take some plants and they will commit suicide. So that's a main issue also in the community. So we were working, telling them that they have rights, and also that they can say something against these economic arrangements that are doing between families, for example, that don't take into account the impact that this case of violence has on the victim. Also, we tell them about their sexual rights, for example, that they can decide the number of children, because they don't have the use of contraception in the community is restricted due to men's beliefs. They don't have that power on decide the number of children, and also because men believe that they can be cheated or they can be betrayed with another man because of this use of contraception. And also the very important thing here was that they can read for the first time their communal statute, so they can begin to outline the mechanisms by which they can file complaints and to obtain true justice, also on the foreign justice, as they will call them, no? So, and also an important challenge nowadays is to get the chief, the PAMU, to make the decision regardless of women's lives. And many women now want to be a part of the board of directors as well, because in the previous history, there hasn't been a woman in that position, and they don't take part or they don't participate in the decisions as indicated in the communal statute. And with at the end of this intervention, we ask them to come up with a phrase that they can spread awareness to the community. And you can see here that they will say, respect me, I'm just like you, all in Spanish and also in Awajún. It was really important also to recover that language. And also here, you can see that it's women, our voices are heard. Let's raise our voices, no to violence against women. So it was really, really important for them. And the next steps are, we are developing also workshops for men to talk about masculinities. We are working to get the chief to genuinely engage and that he can consider that this is really important, that it's a really important problematic in the community. And also that we want to get more women interested and participate, not only the people that work at the project, but also most of the women in the community. So that's all. Thanks. And here are my emails, so you can contact me there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Priscilla, for this really interesting and also inspiring talk, showing the need to address gender-based violence also in a biodiversity conservation project, and how it is linked, again, to rural livelihoods. As was pointed out, we haven't addressed that so much in our own research here at CEF. And I find it very interesting that informal institutions come up now, again, in all presentations. So we probably come back later on to that. With that, I think we move to the last speaker, but before I introduce Emily Brown, Denise already wrote in the Q&A or in the chat that please, if you have any questions, you can start entering from now on in the Q&A section. So feel free to start doing that. And with that, I like to move again from Latin America now to an European practitioner, but working in the Global South. So Emily Brown is a feminist, environmental and social justice activist and freelancer with over 20 years of experience in partnerships and programs supporting women's political participation and leadership. She has worked for many years at Oxfam, an international NGO, I think most of you know, where she was the program manager for a project or program called Raising Her Voice, which supported women's leadership in 17 countries. And in addition, she was a coordinator of several other projects and advisory, had an advisory role within Oxfam in projects in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Emily Brown played then key roles in documenting learning and developing practical programming guides and communities of practice on women leadership across the Oxfam Confederation, and was also within the UK Gender and Development Network active, co-chairing a working group on women's participation and leadership for several years. And with that, Emily, I hand over and you can present us a lot of possible pathways for change and solutions.
No pressure. Hi. Let me just set that up. Lovely. Hi, pleasure to meet you all and be part of this really important conversation this evening for me. My name's Emily and I'm speaking in my personal capacity, drawing on a lot of my experiences with Oxfam, thinking about women's voice, power and leadership, activism and leadership, and the organizing and movement building that comes around that. But yeah, drawing on a lot of that experience from Oxfam, but also in other roles. So a real pleasure to be with you today on a really important day for stopping, taking stock, and just really rethinking. I think all these presentations, hearing the stats, the findings again, it just always is so staggering that we're faced with this, a pandemic of violence, a constant violent presence of this in so many women's lives, and the kind of our inability to grapple with it individually, collectively, politically is just, it's not an accident. It's there for deep control reasons, and I think all of this research and work to unpick and expose that, and the more we do that explicitly is really, really important. As with any of those other invisible forms of oppression and control, thinking about racism and the homophobia phobias and xenophobias as well. It's about our role as practitioners and researchers and communicators is to sort of make it visible and kind of flip those narratives, but also provide practical perspectives on and show good examples of how and what next, especially when these things feel so vast and so complex. But the good news is that there's lots of examples I'll share in this next 15 minutes on sort of certainly from the amazing work of feminist activists and organizing, from very local community groups to national and international feminist organizations. So I hope it provides a bit of inspiration, but a mandate also for us all in our practice. Yeah. So I wanted to share just a little snapshot of this sort of intersect between violence as a form of control and that sense of agency and leadership and activism, the power part. And a really interesting part of this narrative shift that I heard very clearly in some research done by at London School of Economics called Above the Parapet was interviews with women leaders and really reflecting on this role of women in public spaces. And these can be tiny public spaces, you know, even as Priscilla was speaking, in very community level public spaces, you are disrupting something potentially. And this form of disruption is a threat, it's a risk, and we really need to recognize that and what that produces for us, and our responsibilities and duty of care as we as practitioners work around that. But I think it really helps to center that, because it moves it from something that happens to women and a form of sort of conversation about vulnerabilities to something about what's happening around power and status quos. And that again can be around race, religion, you know, challenging norms. So this was a really useful reflection from a colleague of mine, Maritza, in Honduras, and some brilliant work they were doing in post-coup Honduras on femicide, and looking at what was this interplay between the activisms that Oxfam at that time was supporting around landless peasant movements, livelihoods programs, and as women were speaking out and developing the sense of agency, their experiences of violence, collective violence and individual violence sort of shifting. And yeah, just how interesting it is as a kind of a form of deterrent for women's participation in public life, but also, and the examples here are very much about the positive role that women in decision making and positions of influence are playing to challenge that and turn that round. So hang on in there, there's hope here. So I wanted to share, I thought this was a useful framework for the next 10 minutes now. This is something that Oxfam works very closely with. It's called the Gender at Work framework that the organization Gender at Work used to really expose and open up the sort of deep cultural, the elements at play when we're looking at deep cultural resistances and structures of violence, both as we've heard so much at the individual, but also systemic. And the 4 quadrants here speak to, in this top left side, women's and men's consciousness. And that's the sort of our knowledge about our rights, but it's also the confidence. It's about, I was really struck earlier when Constance was talking about 23% of women themselves thinking that wife beating is acceptable. It's those what we normalize as individuals as well. On the top right, it's around access to resources. So the more like tangible contributing or deterrent factors around health, education, the right to vote. But then moving to the lower part of the framework, and this was really helpful when we've done our kind of meta reviews as Oxfam of our evaluations, the sort of sense-making exercises they call them. They've showed very much that we're very good at doing trainings. Top left hand, tick, 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 but much, much harder and poses much more of a challenge, or has done, to think about the work and what our role might be in the systemic change. Again, Oxfam, for example, is much more comfortable in the formal institutions, pushing for laws and policies, budget allocations. But in terms of the informal cultural norms, decision-making spaces, but also the public perceptions for me around women's leadership. Women cannot lead is very common. Women do not make good leaders. So really digging into those is really, really critical. Violence is acceptable, those kind of norms and perceptions and givens, the narratives we tell ourselves. So what I thought is provide an example from each of the four, just to show the kinds of things that the organizations, the women's rights organizations and feminist movements we've been working with in different parts of the world have developed and considered to challenge and shift norms and realities of violence in women's lives in those four different areas. Some of them are a bit of a funny fit, but bear with me. And I hope they help to sort of illustrate how this can be a helpful way of looking at what we can do, where perhaps we have gaps, or we're not paying perhaps attention, or how we can link with other partners and organizations who are strong in that area to sort of create a more holistic approach to thinking and working on violence against women, on gender-based violence. So here's just an example from that top left quadrant, the individual consciousness, power within, power to, and it takes findings from a small scale, but of just under 2,000 women we'd worked with in Nepal, in 3 different districts, who were part of community decision-making structures. They weren't called women's empowerment, they were community decision-making very deliberately, but it focused on supporting women with literacy skills, confidence, just a space to talk. And very quickly they emerged into really quite political spaces and conversations. Again, I was thinking when Priscilla shared the study, it would be, I'm sure, very much the kinds of issues being brought into these spaces that we saw here. After a year and a half, the evaluators ran some self-reported evaluations with participants and with a comparator group, and you'll just see there, in terms of the ones I find so interesting, are both women actively involved in efforts to check, stop and end violence, that sense that together they had an ability and agency to be able to do something concrete in their communities, but also feeling able to influence the council and district development to allocate support for these kinds of work. If you think about the context, this is very remote rural areas with low to no literacy rates. The shift there, 42% of women saying, I feel able to influence their decisions, is really, really quite impressive. So there's something really important about what we know we can do around that sense of consciousness, power within, power to, and the collective nature of that. In the upper right quadrant, so this is around access to resources, I'll speak to something that colleagues of mine at Oxfam Novib use as a really useful methodology in many of their programs, but particularly looking at land use and violence against women and those intersections. And this is one of the very first exercises they encourage husband and wife couples to do together. And it's forming a vision at the end of the world as they'd like to see it, and the steps towards it, and the concrete resources required to get there. So there's the safer things to talk about, like growing our number of chickens, but it's also about a safe space to open up conversations about power, violence. How would we like to be together as a couple and as a family? So those have been really successful, and there's a whole load of resources on the website I can share, or I'll share at the end. The third lower bottom left quadrant, again, really digging into those informal structures, as Sonja and Constance really spoke to around violence against women. This is from a fantastic program deliberately designed with a very strong research and evaluation component, but very strong feminist backbone to it. Sasa Raising Voices in Uganda, looking at by this really strong focus on power, both within couples and in the wider community, has seen a very very strong reduction of physical partner violence rates, and also of concurrent sexual partners. Again, I'll share the link to that at the bottom. that's the SASA report on the right-hand side, really, really useful, packed with, I love their politics and the way they approach it. And the quote here at the top is really, really reflective, I think, of how not being afraid to talk about power in our work has really been helpful, because it's sort of helped make real the root causes, and it's helped then all for the men and women involved really look at what then do you do about it, and obviously facilitated very professionally and very safely by the SASA team and staff members. The second quote there is from a male ally and clan elder in northern Uganda, who was talking, really reflecting on, I was struck again by the sense of the cultural institutions and the respect for the traditional way things have been done. And here there's I think a really clever and powerful flip on that, which is about saying this is about respecting those cultural institutions and our traditions, but using the law and women's, the genuine realities for women for when land is taken away from them, and adding to that, it's not an attack on our history and culture. It's a addition and a positive practice for us to integrate. And finally, on the pathways to change and formal structures, this is some fantastic data from over 5,000 Brazilian local governments, drawing this direct correlation between women's participation in formal public administration, elected positions, and the number of feminist policies, particularly services for victims of violence. And you see this again and again in our project, kind of at programmatic level, that women in municipal governments increasing, as you saw in the Nepal example as well, that there's so very often a sort of direct impact on how money is then allocated to increase the support services for women experiencing violence. This is more of a cross-cutting reflection, and I wanted to share this because for me and for Oxfam, I think it's been really, really important one. It came out in 2013, and we've picked it up and used it in our influencing with the UK government also, really to speak to this power of strong feminist movements. And this has been very powerful evidence and in our work, really also to think about theories of change for effective working, and I mean that both for Oxfam, but I see it a lot in women's rights organisations, feminist donors across the globe, really, which is fantastic. This understanding and a greater focus on building those strong movements who are able to connect strong individual programs or projects and really give them a strength and a voice and a power that is able to push much further. I think another piece here in terms of what we're seeing to call out call out violence against women. Sometimes I'm really depressed, and it feels like, this really powerful creative stuff has been done throughout history by local organizations, by women saying enough. And other times and thinking, where has this got us? And other times I'm so heartened by these powerful ways, and I've included the lyrics here from the Colectivo Letesis, from the Chilean organization, really calling out with unapologetic, the rapist was you, the rapist is you, a very, very powerful shift of this. And I think you see that shift also from Me Too to Time's Up, in kind of calling out and really pushing for proper action and shifts and an end to the systemic structural violence. And a final reflection, I guess, for us, when we looked at in Oxfam, there's been lots of the example there, Ending Violence Against Women, the guide, sort of reflecting on learning. We've done, colleagues of mine in our evaluation team did a fantastic meta review of our women's empowerment programs and found, again, it speaks to the earlier reflection that participation in work that disrupts the status quo, whether it's a livelihoods project or a governance project or a tax justice project, increases the risk of women participating in projects and programs by 10%. And we have to move from a position of it will be a risk factor in a budget and in our proposal to a fact and a reality that we have to embed much more seriously and much more politically in the design of our research, in the design of our programs, in the design of our campaigning and in our partnerships, our local partnerships. And again, I think sometimes that feels scary, or how do we do that? But you know, there's lots of examples, both in Oxfam's work. This quote is from two of our program frameworks, kind of just encouraging and signposting our colleagues to the kinds of things that we need to be budgeting for in order to not be increasing the risk for participants in our work, their experiences of violence. But I think that's really a challenge, and it's quite a seismic shift if you think about it for all our work. And it's one that I think is there's no more excuses. We know what happens when we don't think about this in our work. We know how grave the experiences for women participating in development programming, conservation programming. We know this now, and I think it's on us to walk the talk and really engage with what this means in really serious ways. So yes, I just thought I'd share. This is sort of resources from the more kind of formal Oxfam side of things, including a piece of work here that a colleague and I did to summarize some of those governance and violence connections, but also just this was just yesterday, even on LinkedIn and Twitter feeds, and sort of seeing there's just so much phenomenal feminist work around land rights, climate change, natural resource management, and that I think the more that we can, as practitioners, academics and researchers, and that's why spaces like this today are so important, make those connections and take guidance from feminist organizations about the very practical things that they do in how they partner, how they transfer funds, how they engage, how they train and support. There's so much rich learning there, and increasingly well documented as well, that I think again it feels like a really exciting time to make those connections and integrate that approach much more into the day and DNA, the everyday of what and how we work. So huge thanks, and really looking forward to some of the questions and conversation now.
Thank you very much, Emily, for this also very enlightening and inspiring talk, presenting a whole range of pathways at different areas and levels to address gender-based violence. I found it very striking that you actually mentioned that development projects also led to an increase of gender-based violence. That is, I think, the opposite we want to achieve, and it's very good to hear also how Oxfam approaches to that. And I think it gives your talk gave a lot of hope, but the previous talks also addressed solutions. So I think altogether there is ideas and hopes and solutions and for implementation. I was very positively surprised that Oxfam already used also research to accompany the impact analysis. I think probably that is also an area where research can become more active in future. And that brings me already to the next section where we have a brief panel discussion, and meanwhile the audience, you can enter your questions in the Q&A session. And while you type, I would like to ask Constance and Sonja exactly to coming back to the research. Where do you actually see still major knowledge gaps regarding gender-based violence and further research needs. Also how to link it maybe better from the violence to rural development outcomes, and which topics maybe should be addressed more or better understood by research. So maybe Constance, maybe you start, and then Sonja continues.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tina. So obviously from the point of view of Northern Ghana, I think that we need research, empirical research in the area of gender-based violence and the specific ways in which it affects outcomes in livelihoods. So for my presentation, when I looked around for literature, I did not find much on this topic. And so what my presentation did was to draw on my ethnographic field work, which is based on a specific rural community. Of course, I have a lot of knowledge and experience of the settings across Northern Ghana, and I brought this on board as well. But I think it will really be useful to be able to commission research into how the specific ways in which gender-based violence affect livelihood outcomes and rural development in general in Northern Ghana. But what is also important is research that will also help us first. You know, all of us activists, NGOs, including Oxfam and all the other international and local ones that work in Northern Ghana for over the decades have tried to undo or to transform these sociocultural factors and practices that are dehumanizing and that impede women's equal participation in development. But they are just here. They prove almost impossible to undo. So probably I think it is time for us to also be doing research into how to even transform them. First of all, before the interventions, I think I shared this with you, Tina, when I went to do a gender training on gender and violent extremism in a border town. And they said to me that women's source of vulnerability to violent extremism is their inability to own land, which is not their making, it's just because of the patrilineal inheritance system, to own land and also cattle, which are the main productive resources in that particular municipality that I went to do this work. And then I turned to the traditional leaders who were all part, chiefs and their elders and all of them, and I said, yes. So if this is the vulnerability, how do we address this issue so that women will not be easy targets of extremist groups? And then a chief who had been so vocal turned and looked and said, no, I'm sorry, but that isn't something we can do because it is tradition. And then I asked, we put a tradition in place, you know, they have been changing. So why is it that when it comes to the specific situation of women, you say that it is tradition, we cannot do anything about it? So I think we even need research to be able to understand the how of transforming these norms and cultural practices before then intervening, sustaining intervention on how to create awareness about the fact that, so at that workshop, I did say to you, I said, well, I'm not like super achieved, but just imagine that you have children, daughters, mothers, wives, if you like me, who can afford to do this kind of, facilitate this kind of training. How will you meet? So I think we need to combine this. First of all, to understand the impact and also how to even tackle these deep-seated norms and practices. Thanks.
Thank you. Sonja, your thoughts?
Hey, thanks, Tina. I think we have spent a lot of time working on drivers and impact of domestic violence. I think the focus now needs to shift on finding solutions on domestic violence, and most importantly, trying to understand why these, the legislations or the legal, the frameworks that have been put in place over the last 15 years have not been working to curb the rising tide of domestic violence. So from between 1930 and 2015, the number of countries that had legislation against violence against women increased from 4 to 75, which is a large increase. But in all of these countries that introduced legislation, the laws didn't really help to support women or protect women against domestic violence. So we need to understand why that is happening and how laws can be designed in a way that actually affects or protects women. And I was also very happy to see a lot of discussion around informal institutions, which is one of my work also supports that informal institution might play an important role in protecting domestic violence or protecting women from against violence. But we also need to think about the design of this informal institution very carefully, because if this is rushed and not very carefully designed, then there is a risk that this might backfire, and this might even increase women's vulnerability against domestic violence, because there are evidence, or not necessarily research, but there is news media reports from various parts of Pakistan to suggest that these informal institutions can be perpetrators, and they actually don't respect women's rights, and they can be like perpetrating violence against women. So we should not do anything that might make women even more, put women's life even more at risk than the risk that they're already facing. So I think the bottom line, we need to shift our attention, research attention, to understanding these kind of frameworks that can effectively protect women from violence against women. I think we spent a lot of time already looking at drivers and understanding impacts. It's time to think about solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings me already to another question, then how we really achieve this change, how we achieve more implementation also at institutional and political level. And Priscilla, Emily, what would you say? How can we better reach the policy implementers and decision makers at different levels so that gender-based violence is more addressed? And how can we motivate them? And maybe also for us as researchers, which role can we as researchers play in this process? Priscilla, maybe if you like to start, and then I hand over to Emily.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Yeah, I think it's really important that we as NGOs and also as researchers, we take place in this discussion. For example, here in Peru, we are facing many political crises nowadays, and there is like a very big advance of fundamentalist and anti-rights groups that, for example, want to eliminate that word gender in all of the policies and all the laws. So it's really alarming. So we as NGOs and women organizations, feminist groups are working towards that to prevent them, to eliminate these, to take like a step back from what we have achieved. No? And also in part of that, it's really important that we participate in roundtables, for example, and we do a lot of political advocacy. So we can get to be part of this governmental institutes, and we can, for example, propose more laws with a gender, intersectional, and intercultural approach that can be implemented. And also it's really important, if we have the laws, that we can assure that these are working, because in many cases, we can see that it's not really effective. And as my colleagues were telling before, we are facing with a backfire of the approach that we are taking towards eliminate gender-based violence. No? So it's really important to be a part of the conversation, to do a lot of political advocacy, and to be there so we can avoid these back steps. So I think that's for me, and maybe Emily could tell us more about what she has learned in Latin America as well.
Yeah, I think this is obviously it's a really tough one, but I think for me there's two levels or spaces where more work clearly is so useful, and one is this continued investment in the really political work with groups of women in communities, that without that, I think, we can do lots of campaigning at this level, but without this, it's not grounded and it's not meaningful for women. And I think thinking about whether it's, just alternative justice systems, dispute resolution mechanisms that are right for that context, and intersecting identities of those women very particularly, that continues to need, I think, a lot of support. And sadly for donors, it's boring, we've done it, why isn't it working? But this for me needs to just keep being the heart and soul of what and how we do. I think policies matter, the money matters, et cetera, I think there's something about the bit in the middle between very local and national, district level. We know district level and provincial level assemblies and decision-making spaces have a lot of power and influence in terms of how money from up here does or doesn't get through. So that's an important space. And then something for me, I think, is really important, and it's exciting to be at this moment in history, is around the narratives, is around how we talk about this, how we communicate it differently. So it's not, oh, that's a shame, ooh, isn't it terrible, and start to shift the sense amongst all of us in clever ways, and seeing so many different groups and practitioners finding different ways of opening the issue and the solutions and the power. It's fundamentally, again, back to power and resources, and how do we keep finding smart, creative, uncompromising ways to keep bringing that back onto the table, so it gets the action it needs in all the spaces.
Great, thanks a lot. That's very, very interesting. I am aware of two questions right now. Denise, I think I will hand over the word to you, that you can guide us through the questions which have arrived by now.
Okay, thank you. Well, we have two questions. One that was directed to Priscilla and that she already answered on the availability of contraceptives and gynecologists. So thank you, Alexandra, for your question, and Priscilla for your answer. We have only one open question for Constance, and as far as I can see, Constance is already answering the question, and it's about the steps that should come first to set the ground for further changes. However, while Constanza answered these questions, I would like to refer to an open question here that comes from Eva. That's also directed to Constance. I'm sorry that you have to pay attention to two questions at the same time, but Eva says it's also directed to everybody who would like to answer this question among the panelists. So she thanks Constanza for mentioning the role of religion and gender-based violence in rural setting, especially in resource-scarce areas, and the specific questions. Do we observe here a reverse resource curse, meaning that the scarcer the resources are, the more likely it is that women, or most vulnerable, suffer from gender-based violence or being abused or used as scapegoats? So what will we observe in the future, taking climate change and increasing resource scarcity as a matter of fact? Right. I don't know if the question is clear. I think it is.
Yeah, I can attempt to answer that. Yeah. So thanks very much for this question. So first of all, what I'll say is that absolutely, once there is a resource trace, chances are that people are likely to be frustrated and to take it on the one who is less powerful in that relationship. But I think this issue is actually beyond resource scarcity, in the sense that, as we know from the interventions in the field of women's empowerment, such as microcredit facilities and all of that. So even if you were to economically empower the women without transforming the structural factors that make it possible for a man to exact violence on a woman, to abuse her or to take over that loan from her, it is still violence against women is still likely to occur. So, well, there are really concerns about the harsh climatic conditions and the climate change effects and all of that that is happening. But I think that our core task is to be able to focus on these kind of power dynamics that are really the bottom line. I mean, that are really the underlying causes of violence against women.
Thank you, Constance. I don't know if any of you would like to complement this question. Okay. There is no other question here. Then, Tina, I ask you, there is time for one more question on my side, or we can also move on, depends on you and how much.
No, go ahead with your question. I have millions, but I also look at the time, and we should keep it then when there are no more other questions. Please ask your questions, and then we can start with a wrap up of the session.
Excellent. Yeah, this is a question that runs my head since very long, and it has to do with something at least two of you have mentioned, that the many of these gender-based violence pervasive practice are justified or explained in terms of traditions, no? And how to address this dichotomy and this problem, how to address the need to respect indigenous and local autonomy and traditions, and at the same time respect the human rights of women. I mean, they are fighting for themselves. We don't need to fight their fights, but we need to support them. But we have this dichotomy, this paradox, no, of respecting their rights as indigenous and at the same time support their human rights. I don't know if any of you would like to address this question.
All right, so I'll try. Yeah, so I guess the point here, or the key issue to look at, is traditional or indigenous norms and practices that are inimical to women's rights. So sometimes we get charged. So, okay, you are a decolonial scholar, and yet you are talking to us about women's rights, children's rights, and all of that. And I say, yes, so decolonization is not against protecting people's rights. And gender activism is not about undoing indigenous norms and practices that are dear to people. Our focus here is on transforming those that dehumanize women, transforming those that treat women as if they were less human than men. So I think this is the issue here, to target those that are dehumanizing, but then to preserve and to continue to highlight the good ones.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thank you very much for your view, Constance.
Would anybody else like to add, or?
Yeah, I think just a little bit adding to what Constance was addressing. I think it's really important that we can like draw a line, and we can say that the limit is the human rights. So we don't have to violate those human rights. And I think that's really an important approach to getting to work with these communities, that we are coming and we don't have to normalize violence. For example, in indigenous communities in Peru, they have many traditions, but they, for example, for forced unions with children, with girls that are like 13, 12, and they are pregnant. So we have to make them understand that they have, for example, sexual and reproductive rights, and that's the line. And I think that with these many workshops and many interventions, they are coming to get to a point, especially women, where they can know and they can address that those are their rights. And because they already noticed that those previous traditions have consequences on their health, on their mental health. And I think that that's a really important step to work further forward to eliminate gender-based violence in these communities.
Denise, you're muted.
Thank you very much for this. I'm sorry, my connection failed for a while. We have just another question, but it's related to just the question I did about contradictions between traditions and women's rights. So I think looking at the time, we can move on to the closing remarks. It will take just a few minutes. I don't want to repeat, of course, everything that it has been said. I am very, of course, grateful to the 4 presenters and for sharing their knowledge, for sharing their thought with us. It's clear that this is the result of years of reflection and work on the issue. So the speakers helped us to confirm that gender-based violence is neither alien, nor a peripheral topic to development and to development research. And from evidence from both quantitative and qualitative studies, and qualitative research, they really show us the devastating impact of gender-based violence on women's rights, on children education, and even in the security of physical bodies, human lives. But they also, of course, show us that there are spaces and opportunities for change and transformation. Particularly, Sonja has shown us that the future of millions of children are being affected due to intimate partner violence, which makes us reflect on the real possibility of a hopeful and just future for all humanity. It's a very serious issue that she has called our attention to. And Constance, taking the example of Ghana, particularly Northern Ghana, of course, has called our attention on pervasive uses and practice based on patriarchal sociocultural norms that put women's livelihood options at risk, moreover, their own lives are put at risk. And at the end of the day, gender-based violence, as also was underlined by Emily, it's a mechanism of fear and shame, as mechanisms to control female bodies and lives. Priscilla, taking the example of Peru, and the community of the Ayahun in the Amazon area, has shown that gender violence cross also ethnic and economic forms of subordinations, and how working with women as well as with men open opportunities to raise women's voices. And Emily has provided us with practical perspectives on how to tackle gender-based violence and inspired us also to disrupt. I really very much like this word disrupt, and talk more about power than talking about vulnerability. That was really great. She has given us 4 areas mainly to act, change of individual consciousness, access to resources, work with informal structures, talking without fear about power, and talking about working with formal structures. And I want to finish this closing remarks saying that it has been clear from the presentations that legal regulations or any top-down measures are necessary but are not enough. If this idea of male superiority does not change at the deepest levels in people's imaginations and subjectivities, that's also us, our imaginaries and subjectivities. And if structural inequalities are not tackled through our research practice, I think most of us here belong to the academic world, and even to our day-to-day activism, that it's not opposite to carry on academic research. So with this word, I would like to thank again the presenters, the directors for their support, Tina for leading the organization of this event that has been great, and our public relations department at CEF. Please, Tina, over to you.
Thanks, Denise. That was wonderful. And there's nothing else left for me to, again, thank you very much to each and everyone in the audience for being with us here today. We appreciate your keen interest in the event, and I'm sure you learned, like me, a lot, and I hopefully also got more inspired to engage in the topic of gender-based violence. My special thanks really go to our four distinguished speakers with their excellent presentations. It was fantastic to have you here representing also several continents and so diverse and yet similar experiences. That was very, very enriching. So we appreciated that you shared your insights and thoughts with us today. And with that, I would like to close the event and wish all participants and panelists the best, and hope you will get involved in breaking the silence. I should share my final screen. And we look forward to welcoming you to another event at ZEF. And with that, for now, goodbye, take care.
Thank you very much.